Resolved. Video games glorifying gun violence should be banned. Only recently have violent video games, or video games in general, been considered aspects of popular culture within the United States. However, violence itself has always permeated our culture, from the Wild West through the Revolution to modern day. Any argument against violent video games on the grounds that they influence their users to commit acts of violence is simply an attempt to provide a stopgap solution to a much larger problem, that being the overall violent culture of the United States and the massive political and societal reforms needed to change this culture. Many argue that the images of gun violence depicted in video games influences users to commit such acts in the real world. However, if this were the case, then nations such as Japan and Korea, whose levels of violent video game use are greater than those of the United States, um, should see greater levels of gun violence and violence in general. However, their levels of gun violence and violence are fractions of those than in the United States. So it seems to be a larger issue than just video games themselves. Um, other or group of issues which contribute to violence in the real world. Otherwise, we should have seen higher levels of violence in Japan and Korea if we strictly used the logic behind this proposed ban. Um, Reasoning for the ban aside, any attempts to implement a ban would face a dizzying amount of obstacles. For one, there are already millions upon millions of violent video games being used within American households at this very moment that people have already paid for. If a ban against any future sales or creation of violent video games was implemented, then people would simply continue playing these violent video games that they already own. Also, if the government attempted to remove these games from their owner's possession, it would be unconstitutional, as these games would be grandfathered into legality. And if the government plans a reimbursement model to removing these games from people's households, taxpayers would be shelling out in upwards of $1 billion in reimbursements. Our culture of violence gave rise to violent video games, not vice versa. Also, any ban imposed would be unmaintainable and would only serve to make ordinary citizens into criminals for disobeying such an illogical law.